In these example sentences, we tried to use semicolons, and semicolons are perfectly good ways to connect sentences, but you have to make sure of one very important rule. So let's take a look at these examples. The first thing I do is take off my shoes, semicolon, after coming home from work. So here we don't really even need the semicolon. We can just leave this as the first thing I do is take off my shoes after coming home from work. No reason to separate them. And the other way to think about this, and this is the important rule, is when you use a semicolon, each thing that you're separating has got to be a complete sentence. So you use a semicolon to separate two independent complete sentences. And in this case, we don't have that. This second part is not a complete sentence. It's a fragment if you were to leave it by itself. So connecting with these with a semicolon is unnecessary. In fact, we could just drop the semicolon. When I arrived at the medical center for surgery, semicolon, I met with the surgeon who would be leading the operation. So this is a little bit closer because at least we've got a subject and a verb in the first part. But this is not an independent clause. And we'll talk about subordinate clauses in, I think, a few videos. Yeah, like 3 videos from now. But the point is this cannot stand on its own, right? If I walked up to you and said, when I arrived at the medical center for surgery, what? Right? You're waiting for the completion to that. It's dependent on something that's going to be coming later. So in that case, as we're going to see when we talk about these, all you would need here is a comma. A semicolon would be unnecessary because these are not 2 complete sentences. I totally forgot that the gymnastics meet was today, not tomorrow. So here, again, this is not a complete sentence, so using a semicolon is inappropriate. All we would need here is a comma to show that it's today, not tomorrow. This contrast, no need to use a semicolon. My professor, my cosmology professor, said that the homework was difficult. However, I finished it in less than an hour. So here, this comes back to a previous error that we've seen. This is actually a comma splice. Because however, think about it, fanboys, however is not a coordinating conjunction. So we can't just use a comma and a however to connect 2 complete sentences. So we have a comma splice. What do we do? Well, there's a lot of ways to fix it. I guess technically, could you add a coordinating conjunction and however? That's weird. The best way to fix this is just make this a semicolon, because now you've got 2 complete sentences separated with a semicolon, no problem. Finally, the mayor ordered the removal of the parking meters because the town residents argued that they hurt the downtown economy. Again, we've got this dependent clause starting with because. It's not an independent clause, just like the when sentence up here wasn't independent. So I can't use a semicolon here to connect them. And in fact, as we'll talk about when we talk about subordinate clauses, I don't need any punctuation here at all. I can just put these together. It's not a run-on. We'll get into why later, but no need for a semicolon to separate sentences like these. So remember, regardless of the details and the specifics of these examples, the main rule is that a semicolon must connect 2 complete sentences. In other words, 2 independent clauses. You can't have fragments on either side. You can think of it as like a semicolon splice is legal, where a comma splice isn't. You can't just use a comma to connect them. A semicolon splice, just using a semicolon, is perfectly fine. In terms of meaning, generally we prefer to use semicolons if the 2 clauses express a related idea, if they're very close to each other. You probably wouldn't use a semicolon for 2 contrasting sentences unless you had a word like however, for example, to show that contrast. That's a very minor point. You're never going to have to choose, for example, between a sentence connected with a semicolon and a sentence connected with a comma and a conjunction. They're both grammatically correct. It's a matter of taste which one you go with. It's very fine differences in meaning. The SAT will never test you on that, but you do need to know that they've got to be connected with 2 complete sentences. Let's look at some examples of how the semicolon is used properly. The shareholders were getting impatient. The CEO knew he needed to improve the company's quarterly numbers. So here we've got 2 complete sentences. We're getting impatient. The CEO knew he needed to improve the company's numbers. Separated with a semicolon, perfect. Link sighed as he drew his sword. He had already completed 2 dungeons today and was tired. Again, 2 complete sentences. Separated with a semicolon, perfect. The rocket jettisoned its first stage. There was no need for the ship to carry that dead weight into orbit. Again, 2 complete sentences. Semicolon. He thought he'd sent the memo before he left for the day. However, the boss never received it. So here we've got two complete sentences. Here we use that word however to show that kind of contrast between the two sentences, and everything is fine structurally. So that's the major way you use a semicolon, and probably the only way you'll see it on the new SAT. But I do want to emphasize that there's one other use for semicolons that you will see in the wild, one other major use. I don't know if you'll see it on the new SAT, but I wanted to bring it up just in case. It's a very minor edge case. So let's look at this sentence. I've lived in Tallahassee, Florida, Sacramento, California, Austin, Texas, and New York, New York. We've got a list of places where this person lived, and notice these are actually grouped together. Austin, Texas, New York, New York, Tallahassee, Florida, city, state. When you have a city and its state, you always use a comma to separate them. But when you put them in a list, it gets a little bit weird because not only do the city and the state have to be separated with a comma, but each element in this list, which I've underlined in blue, has also got to be separated with a comma. So it's hard to read the sentence. Is it Tallahassee in Florida, or is it Tallahassee like and Florida and Sacramento and California and Austin? It's confusing to read. So what you would do to alleviate this confusion is put semicolons after each of the elements of the list. So this doesn't follow the rule above. These aren't complete sentences, but it's its own special little case we just use to punctuate lists that would otherwise be confusing if we used all commas. So again, this is an edge case. Very unlikely you'll see this on the test. You certainly will see it in real life, but just in case it shows up, you'll know how to handle it.